She came to Rome with millions of dollars and a simple request, and left in tears. Katharine Drexel was one of the wealthiest women in America, and she had devoted herself entirely to those who had nothing. Native Americans, Black Americans, communities living at the edges of a society that had largely forgotten them. She had funded schools, built missions, and crossed the continent to serve people most of her class never thought about at all. Now she sat before the most powerful man in the Catholic world, asking him for one thing: more missionaries to continue the work. His answer would change everything. Not because he said no, but because he asked her something instead. Something so simple it could have come from a child, but something so devastating it brought her to her knees and kept her there for the rest of her life. Philadelphia, February 18th, 1885. The slow and solemn death knell of the church rings out in the crisp winter air. Hundreds have gathered for the funeral of one of the wealthiest men in America, Francis Anthony Drexel. Francis inherited the banking business his father had created and helped build it into one of the great financial dynasties of 19th century America. Now passed to his eternal reward, Francis's 3 daughters would be the beneficiaries of his enormous estate. The amount of his net worth at the time of his death was estimated to be around $15 million in 1885, equivalent to around $500 million in today's money. Katharine Drexel received 1/3 of this amount and instantly became one of the wealthiest Americans at the time. What few outside her circle knew was that behind the Drexel name and the Drexel fortune was a young woman with an unusual preoccupation. While her peers concerned themselves with the social season, Katharine had for years been quietly directing her attention and her money toward 2 communities most of America had chosen to overlook: Native Americans living on government reservations and Black Americans who faced significant barriers to education and opportunity. The fortune she now inherited would simply allow her to do more. In the months following her father's death, Katharine threw herself into the work. She traveled to the Sioux reservations of Dakota and saw entire families crowded into wretched conditions, children malnourished, elders dying, while the federal government broke treaty after treaty. In New Mexico, she witnessed Navajo and Apache peoples stripped of their land, their ceremonies forbidden, their children torn from their families and sent to boarding schools where they were beaten for speaking their native tongue. She began writing checks: a school here, a mission there, medicine, food, teacher salaries. In 1885, she and her sisters made one of their first major acts following their father's death, contributing funds to the St. Francis Mission on South Dakota's Rosebud Reservation. It would not be the last. But every night, kneeling in the chapel of some remote mission, the same thoughts returned. Money was not enough. What these people needed was not just funds, but devoted lives. Consecrated hands willing to go where few would follow. She had confided as much to her spiritual director, Bishop O'Connor, who had been guiding her soul since her childhood summers in Torresdale. In 1887, the Drexel sisters traveled to Europe, and Katharine used every connection at her disposal to secure something remarkable: a private audience with Pope Leo XIII. She entered the papal chambers, knelt in greeting before him, and then, given the floor, began to speak about the people no one else was speaking for. Katharine explained to the Pope the work she had been doing: the reservations, the schools, the missions barely surviving on the edge of the frontier. She was willing to give whatever was needed: her time, her connections, her fortune. Everything she had, she placed on the table. But the Pope wasn't interested in what she had. He was interested in what she was. He listened without interruption. When she finished, silence filled the room. He did not reach for a ledger of available missionaries. He did not consult an aide. He simply looked at the woman sitting before him, and with the gentleness that disguised nothing of its devastating weight, asked her 7 words that would rearrange everything she thought she knew about herself. Why don't you become a missionary yourself? She did not answer. She could not. The woman who had negotiated with bishops, funded schools across the continent, and faced down the indifference of an entire nation was speechless. not from lack of words, but from the sudden, terrifying sense that every word she had ever prepared for this moment was now completely useless. She left the meeting deeply shaken and in tears. She felt frightened, confused, and even physically sick as the implications began to dawn on her. Katharine returned from Rome carrying a question she could not put down. Back home, she did what she had always done in moments of uncertainty. She went to her spiritual director, Bishop James O'Connor. She told him what the Pope had said. She told him what she felt. She told him she believed she was being called to religious life. O'Connor listened carefully. Then he said no. Not unkindly, not dismissively, but firmly. Her constitution was too fragile for the demands of religious life. Her fortune was more useful administered from the outside. Her social connections gave her access to politicians and bishops that no nun could ever have. The mission needed her money and her influence, not her vow of poverty. He had good reasons, sensible reasons, the kind of reasons that are very hard to argue with. So she argued with them anyway. She pushed back. She wrote to him. She made her case with clarity and with passion that surprised even herself. She was certain of this calling. She was ready. She was willing. Whatever the cost, whatever the sacrifice, she would pay it. And she almost believed it. Because deep down, beneath the certainty she presented to the bishop, a quieter and more devastating voice was saying something else entirely. Something she hadn't told O'Connor. Something she had barely admitted to herself. She didn't think she was worthy. Not the practiced objections the bishop raised, those she could fight. This was something harder to defend against. Who was she to lead other women in religious life? Who was she to found a congregation? She knew her own faults. She knew the distance between the woman she was and the woman such a calling demanded. The bishop thought she wasn't suitable. He wasn't the only one. For 2 years this battle raged. External arguments with her director, internal arguments with herself. Until finally, exhausted and stripped of the performance of certainty, Katharine sat down and wrote O'Connor the truth. Not the passionate, reasoned defense he had received before, just the truth. She wasn't sure she was worthy. Perhaps he had been right all along. Perhaps she had been fooling herself. Perhaps the voice she had mistaken for a calling was nothing more than the ambition of a wealthy woman looking for a grander purpose. She sent the letter and waited. O'Connor's reply came back, and it contained words she was not prepared for. The man who had spent 2 years telling her no, who had listed every reason she was unsuitable, every obstacle her fragile constitution and sheltered life presented, that same man wrote to her now with certainty that took her breath away. I was never so sure of any vocation, not even my own, as I am of yours. If you do not establish the order in question, you'll allow to pass an opportunity of doing immense service to the church, which may not occur again. Even as a foundress, you will have your faults, but God, not you, will do the work. He often makes use of very weak instruments. The question is not, will you be all you should be, but does God will you to be his instrument? The woman who had argued so fiercely for her own vocation had needed, in the end, to stop arguing, to stop performing, to tell the truth. And it was that humility, more than all her passionate letters and carefully reasoned arguments, that finally convinced him. On March 19, 1889, the feast of St. Joseph, Katharine made her retreat and her final promise to God. She wrote to O'Connor afterward, I had a lovely retreat. It was only this morning that I could promise our Lord to please him by entering fully into your plan of founding an order. As long as I look on self, I cannot. Our Lord gives and will give me the grace always to look at him. 6 weeks later, on May 7, 1889, Katharine Drexel crossed the threshold of the Sisters of Mercy convent in Pittsburgh. She was 30 years old. And the woman who had spent 2 years arguing she was ready finally was. She entered that convent door with nothing settled. No congregation yet founded, no schools yet built, just a woman of fragile health and immense fortune, stepping into a narrow cell and a coarse habit, trading marble halls for a straw mattress. It had taken 2 years to get through that door. 2 years of argument, of doubt, of letters written in the small hours, of a battle fought on two fronts, against the objections of the man she trusted most, and against the voice inside her own soul that whispered she was not enough. And from that unlikely beginning, something extraordinary was unleashed. Over the next 4 decades, she founded more than 60 schools, 50 missions across 16 states, and personally administered more than $20 million. Every cent directed towards those America had chosen to forget. When the Ku Klux Klan burned her schools, she rebuilt them. When bishops questioned her, she waited and applied again. Every attack was met with prayer. Every closed door was eventually opened. And then there was Xavier University, founded in 1915 in New Orleans, the first and only Catholic university in the United States for African Americans. Critics called it delusional. Katharine simply built it. Decades later, Xavier graduates were among the lawyers who argued Brown versus Board of Education before the Supreme Court. Today, Xavier remains the single largest producer of African American students entering medical schools in the United States. By the time she died on March 3, 1955, at the age of 96, her personal bank account showed a balance of $0. Every cent of an inheritance worth hundreds of millions in today's money had been converted into desks and diplomas, into bread and medicine, into the proposition that every human being bore the image of God. All of it born from a simple question, asked quietly in Rome by an old man who saw something in a young woman that she could not see in herself.